The first snow of the season came early that year, sweeping down the spine of the Rockies like a white, silent tide. By dawn, every cabin in the valley sat half buried in drifts, their roofs bowed under fresh weight, their windows rimed with thick frost. A north wind rolled across the timberline, bending the pines, carrying with it that deep, unforgiving cold. Only the mountain west knows cold that burns the lungs, cold that steals the feeling from your fingers before you even realize you're in danger. Out here, winter wasn't just a season. It was an exam you had to pass the year after year, or you simply didn't stay. Most settlers answered that winter the same way their fathers and grandfathers had, with a stone fireplace pushed against the north wall, a pile of split logs stacked high by the door, and the quiet hope that the flames would last until morning. They wrapped themselves in every blanket they owned, slept in their coats, and rose again and again through the night to feed the fire before the cold could creep back in. But there was one cabin, small, rough-hewn, nothing special to look at from the outside, that didn't behave like the others. Its windows were clear. Its chimney emitted only the faintest thread of smoke. And its owner, a quiet Scandinavian named Elias Norberg, slept through the night without tending a fire even once. People had laughed at that cabin when it was being built. They shook their heads at the odd, oversized wall Elias raised in the center of the single-room structure, a thick, uneven mass of stone and clay that looked nothing like a proper hearth. Too bulky, too ugly, too strange. A waste of good space, they said. A fool's wall. Yet as the storm deepened, something unexpected happened. While neighbors huddled by their firesides, shivering when the flames dipped low, Elias woke warm enough to sit at his table with no coat, warm enough that the air inside his cabin held steady long after the fire had gone cold. A few settlers paused on the road that morning, staring at the faint steam drifting from Elias's roof, wondering how a man with such an idiot's wall could be the only one in the valley untouched by the cold. They didn't know it yet. But that ugly wall was about to challenge everything they believed about heat, fire, and survival in the American frontier. Elias Norberg didn't arrive in the Rockies the way most settlers did. He did not come west chasing gold, nor running from debt, nor searching for wide-open land to plow under. He came quietly, carrying only a few tools, a wool coat worn glossy at the elbows, and a mind shaped by a lifetime of watching how heat behaved in the coldest corners of the world. Born along the ragged coastline of northern Scandinavia, Elias grew up in a place where winter ruled half the year and threatened the other half. His childhood home was a low stone cottage where fire was never taken for granted. He learned early that warmth was not simply produced, but managed. You could burn a whole forest and still freeze if you didn't understand how heat moved. As a young man, he worked in the trades most men avoided. The charcoal pits where workers tended earthen mounds glowing red beneath the soil. The lime kilns that turned stone into powder under intense heat. The timber drying sheds where entire walls were built to trap and release warmth slowly over days, not hours. These places were hard, dirty, and dangerous, but they taught Elias something crucial. Materials have memories. Stone, clay, sand, and even the right kind of river rock could soak in heat like a sponge drinking water. If shaped, correctly layered, packed, or channeled, they could release that warmth slowly, predictably, long after the fire itself had died. Old craftsmen shared sayings that stuck with him. A fire warms you once. A good wall warms you twice, once when you build it, and once for every night afterward. So when
Traditional
Elias
layouts
crossed the
like this
Atlantic
one
at
can waste
32
6 to
and found work
70%
in
of the heat
Pennsylvania's
produced,
industrial
with
yards,
most of it
he
escaping
already
straight
had
through
an
the
eye for
chimney.
thermal behavior. In the iron foundries, he watched molten metal roll like sunrise across the molds. And he observed how brick and stone absorbed the blast of heat from the furnaces. He learned that the hottest fires didn't matter nearly as much as how long a structure could hold their energy. America was obsessed with speed and output. Elias was obsessed with retention. By the time he reached Wyoming territory after 5 years saving wages, studying the western climate, and following the promise of homestead land, he understood something few frontier families did. The West was not just colder, it was hungrier. It devoured heat, faster pulled warmth out of walls, quicker stole energy from every poorly built cabin. When he stepped off the coach into the wide, wind-beaten valley that would become his home, Elias did not rush to cut logs like the other men. Instead, he knelt down, scooped a handful of the valley's sandy soil, and let it run through his fingers. He looked at the rocky ridge above the creek and saw not obstacles, but raw materials. He felt the direction of the night wind and noted how it curled against the foothills. He watched how the morning sun fell in a soft arc across the clearing, while others hammered and sawed their cabins together in 2 or 3 weeks. Elias spent 2 full seasons watching measuring sketching and listening to the land, to the cold, to the memory of stone. It wasn't laziness. It wasn't hesitation. It was preparation. Because in Elias's mind, a cabin wasn't just shelter. It was a battle plan for surviving winter. Long before Elias laid a single stone, the settlers around him had already built their cabins, quick, simple by-the-book structures copied from one generation to the next. To a newcomer, these cabins looked sturdy enough: tight log walls, a stout roof, a stone hearth tucked neatly against the north or east wall. It was the same pattern used in Ohio, Indiana, and Pennsylvania for decades. What changed what worked? Except it didn't truly work. Not out here. Not in the teeth of a Mountain West winter. The design flaw was invisible to the eye, but merciless in practice. When settlers placed their fireplaces against an outer wall, they unknowingly handed half their heat straight back to the wilderness. The stone chimney bled warmth into the open air. The logs surrounding it, thin and poorly insulated, released what little heat they caught far too quickly. Inside those cabins, heat behaved like a trapped animal, wild, uneven, unpredictable. The space right in front of the fire grew blistering hot.
Measuring shadows, I reckon.
The opposite wall grew so
While we built
cold
the town.
they could frost over from the inside. Children slept wrapped in every quilt the family owned, their backs freezing while their faces burned from the flames. Wet boots left near the hearth dried on one side and froze stiff on the other. Settlers blamed the wood. They blamed the wind. Some blamed bad luck. But the truth was simpler. A cabin made only of wood has no place to store heat. It can feel warm, but it cannot stay warm. Thermal mass stone, clay, dense earth was practically absent in frontier homes. Heat entered, danced around the room, and vanished up the chimney or drifted through the walls. The moment a fire died, the temperature inside dropped like a stone tossed into a river. Many families learned the hard way that sleeping through the night without tending the fire was impossible. Every 2 hours, someone got up to feed the flames, usually the father, sometimes the eldest child on bitter nights, even the mother. It was exhausting. It was dangerous, but it was tradition. Most settlers had never seen a true masonry heater, never studied heat convection, never heard terms like radiant retention or thermal storage. Their only measure of success was how high the flames danced. If the fire roared loud and bright, they believed warmth would follow. They didn't know fire could lie. A strong flame could make a room feel warm while wasting 60 to 70% of its energy through the chimney. High flames looked impressive, but they were a poor teacher. Heat slipped through gaps, rose too quickly, escaped too easily. Elias watched it all with quiet dismay. He saw men hauling cords of firewood they couldn't spare. He saw families huddled miserably at the cabin's hottest point while their breath froze in the shadows. He saw children waking stiff and chilled because the night fire died too soon. To most settlers, this was simply life on the frontier, a hardship you endured, not a problem you solved. But Elias knew better. He knew cold wasn't an enemy to fight with bigger fires. It was a problem to outthink using materials, mass, and design. And while the valley's cabins groaned in the grip of early frost, Elias began planning something radically different. While the rest of the valley spent spring felling lodgepole pines and raising cabins as fast as hands could work, Elias Norberg did something no one understood. He didn't build. He watched. At first, neighbors assumed he was choosing the perfect clearing or waiting for better weather. But spring turned to summer, and Elias still hadn't driven a single notch into a log.
That's where the kitchen is supposed to be.
Instead, he walked the property
gone mad.
with the deliberate patience of a surveyor. Each day he took notes in a small leather-bound book, temperatures, shadows, the way morning frost melted first in some corners and lingered in others. Some nights he stayed awake until dawn, studying how cold air slid down from the ridgeline like invisible water. He followed the wind with strips of cloth pinned to saplings, noting how it curled and twisted around the clearing. He scattered pebbles across the soil at dusk and returned the next morning to see which ones had drawn condensation, recording the places where the ground held the night.
Look
To
at
the other
that.
settlers, it made no sense.
What is he building?
Man's been
I have
here
no
6
idea. It
weeks
looks like
and
a
still
pile of
living in a
rocks.
tent, Jacob
might hear
Miller
you.
muttered while splitting wood one afternoon. He'll freeze come winter, mark my words. By midsummer, the rumors began. He's slow. He's scared. He doesn't know how to build. He ain't right in the head. But Elias ignored all of it. What he was doing wasn't hesitation, it was diagnosis. He knew a cabin built in the wrong place or the wrong orientation could mean months of needless suffering. A misplaced hearth, a poorly aligned wall, a roof angled wrong by 15 degrees. These were mistakes a man paid for, not once, but every single winter night. He studied the valley like a man reading a map of future survival. He watched where animals bedded down because they knew the least drafty corners of the land. He observed how the midday sun soaked certain stones until dusk. He tracked how quickly the creek mist froze when the temperature dropped. Everything told him one truth.
I've never seen a
he'd
wall
only
built
mattered
quite
when
like
he
this.
knew how to hold it. By the
Aye,
second
it's
summer,
rough work.
people had nearly given up
I have
trying
my
to
doubts it will
understand him.
stand.
His tent had faded, patched twice from summer storms, but Elias still hadn't built a cabin. What he had built was a series of small clay test walls, experimental structures only waist-high, shaped from river stones.
What a
and
waste
mud.
of effort!
He heated them with tiny
thinks that
fires,
wall will
placed his
stand.
palm
It's
against
ridiculous.
them, waited hours, and returned to measure how long they stayed warm. Each day, he refined the mixture, more sand for breathability, more clay for adhesion, more stone for mass retention. He was building prototypes, miniature versions
Are you
of something
serious?
no
That's the
one
whole
else could yet
firebox.
imagine. And
It's
slowly
tiny.
a blueprint formed in his
I can't
mind.
believe how warm
Not
it
a
is in here.
fireplace to push heat outward, but a central wall to absorb and release it. Not a chimney designed to exhaust heat, but a structure built to trap and hold it. Not a cabin that warmed only while fire burned, but one that stayed warm long after. While others mocked him for inaction, Elias was quietly preparing a weapon against winter, one plan tested and proven long before the first real stone was laid. By autumn's first chill, he finally stood in the clearing with tools in hand, not to begin building a cabin, but to build the wall that would define it. The first stones Elias hauled from the creek confused everyone. They weren't the flat, neatly stacked slabs most men used for foundations. These were rounded river stones, heavy, mismatched, stubborn things that didn't sit flush without effort. He carried them two at a time, shoulders straining breath, fogging in the cool morning air. Neighbors passing by slowed their wagons, frowning. No man builds a cabin with rocks, like that one said. He's making trouble for himself, said another. And for whoever has to live in that mess after him. They expected him to mark the corners of a typical frontier home, 12 by 16 feet door on the south wall chimney set against the end. Instead, Elias measured a rectangle, then went to the center of the space and began piling stone right there on the dirt floor. A wall in the middle of a cabin, it seemed backwards, wasteful. Some even whispered crazy. Within a week, a rounded pillar of rock was rising from the center, like an oversized monument. Some stones were fist-sized, others as large as a man's head. Elias sorted them meticulously, tapping each one with the back of his hatchet to listen for cracks. He embedded every layer with a thick clay mortar mixed from the creek bank earth, with just enough grit to withstand heat and just enough plasticity to seal against smoke. But what confused his neighbors most wasn't the size of the structure, it was the strange interior cavities Elias shaped with absolute precision. He placed small wooden forms inside the growing mass, creating channels that snaked up across and back down through the wall. Each cavity was shaped by hand, smoothed with a wooden paddle measured and remeasured using a strip of leather marked in inches. Jacob Miller finally wandered over, hands on hips. "What are you doing in there, Norberg?" "That ain't how a hearth's supposed to look. Chimney should be on the wall, not in the middle of your living room." Elias didn't look up. "It isn't a chimney," he said simply. "Then what is it?" "A wall." Miller scratched his head. "A wall? It's 10 times thicker than a wall. Looks more like you're building a fortress." Elias placed another stone carefully, gently, like setting a jewel. "It needs mass." Mass. To most settlers, the word meant nothing. But to Elias, mass was heat's best ally, the only thing that could tame the chaos of fire and turn it into steady, lasting warmth. The wall kept swelling outward, curving awkwardly to accommodate the heat channels within. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't symmetrical. From outside the cabin, through the still empty log frame, people could see its uneven shape, a bulge here, a lopsided ridge there. It looked more grown than built, like a geological accident sprouting from the earth. By late summer, the structure stood chest high and already weighed several tons. Elias built a small firebox at its base, a humble opening no wider than his 2 hands. The neighbors nearly burst with laughter when they saw it. "That's it," someone scoffed. "You spent half the year making that giant rock heap, and your firebox is the size of a bread pan. You ain't gonna heat nothing with that." But Elias wasn't trying to build a big fire. He was trying to build a long-lasting one. With every ugly stone, the wall came closer to its purpose, to absorb the heat slowly, patiently, and release it long after flames faded to ash. The stupid wall, as the valley now called it, was nearly ready for its first battle against winter. By the time the first snow dusted the valley, Elias's cabin was complete, a sturdy log shell wrapped around a hulking stone heart. The neighbors shook their heads whenever they passed it. Some snickered. Some muttered. A few simply pitied him. Man spends all summer building a wall and forgets the house around it. Jacob Miller grumbled more than once. But as December settled in, laughter began to fade. The cold came early that year, sharp, dry, and hungry. Nights plunged past, 20°C. Breath froze in midair. The merciless Wyoming wind found every crack in every cabin, rattling shutters and creeping through loose chinking until families pressed themselves against their fireplaces just to feel alive. In Miller's cabin, the fire roared night and day. Logs burned so fast, his daughters took shifts hauling from the woodpile. Sleep came in fragments, an hour here, 2 hours there, always punctuated by the father climbing from bed to stuff more wood on the flames before the chill returned with teeth. Across the valley, others endured the same ritual. Cut wood, burn wood, wake shivering, repeat. But at Elias's cabin, something unusual happened. He lit his wall only in the evening. In 3 hours of clean, steady flame in the small firebox built at its base. The fire didn't roar or snap. It breathed. The channels hidden inside the mass drew the heat upward in a slow, deliberate path, soaking the stone from within. By the time Elias banked the coals and closed the draft, the wall radiated warmth like a massive slumbering animal. That night, while every other cabin flickered with anxious yellow light, Elias slept. Hours passed. The fire died. The valley froze. But his cabin held the warmth. By dawn, frost coated the windows of every home except his. On the second night of the cold snap, Miller's youngest boy woke, wheezing from the frigid air. Miller, desperate and exhausted, wrapped the child in blankets and trudged through the dark toward Elias's place. He expected to find the man frantic, feeding his fire, praying it wouldn't die. Instead, he found Elias barefoot on the wooden floor, sipping warm broth. "No fire," Miller blurted. "Not since last night," Elias replied softly. Miller stepped inside and stopped. It felt like he'd walked into another world. The air was warm, steady, and gentle. His voice sighed into the heat, the tension leaving his small body. Miller reached out and touched the wall. It was warm. Not hot warm, alive with stored energy. Howie whispered. Elias didn't boast. He didn't lecture. He simply rested his hand on the stone beside Miller's. "This wall," he said, "remembers the fire." Word spread, quickly carried on frigid winds from cabin to cabin. At first, people dismissed it as rumor. But soon the curious and the cold came knocking one after another, stepping into Elias's cabin with disbelief on their faces. "How can this be?" "Where's your fire? What tricks are you using?" Elias answered the same way each time, with patience. And the same simple truth. "I don't burn more wood than you. I just refuse to waste what the fire gives." And just like that, the valley's silence changed. Not the silence of winter's grip, but the silence that comes when doubt is replaced by wonder. For most settlers, heat was simple fire made warmth. And when the fire died, the warmth died with it. But standing in Elias Norberg's cabin, Miller sensed there was something deeper, something almost unnatural about a wall that stayed warm long after the flames were gone. Elias wasn't a scientist by schooling, but decades of watching furnaces, kilns, charcoal pits, and timber-drying sheds had carved the science of heat into him more clearly than any textbook could. So when neighbors came asking how his wall worked, Elias didn't hide the truth. He crouched near the small firebox at the wall's base, tracing a finger along the stone. "Fire burns fast," he began. "Stone burns slow." Blank looks. He tried again. "When you burn wood in an open fireplace, most of the heat leaves before you ever feel it. Up the chimney, into the night, wasted." He tapped the wall solid and dense. "But this holds onto what the fire forgets." He explained in plain frontier terms the only way such things could be explained. 1. Heat likes to run away. 2. Mass slows it down. 3. Slow heat is lasting heat. The settlers leaned in, as Elias described how the wall's interior channels forced hot air to move through the structure at a crawl. Instead of shooting straight up a chimney, heat was trapped, squeezed, guided through nearly a ton of stone. The wall drank it in. When the fire burns, Elias continued, the heat doesn't rush through the room, it sinks into the wall. Hours later, when your fire is ash, this wall gives the heat back to you, steady as your own heartbeat. He pressed his palm to the stone. It's not the flame that keeps you warm. It's the memory. To demonstrate, Elias pulled out a simple thermometer, one he'd purchased years ago in the foundry. He placed it on the cabin floor opposite the wall, then another directly against the logs in Miller's cabin the next morning. Miller's interior reading 29 degrees colder. Same weather, same wood, same sized cabin. The difference stunned them. Elias explained more. Stone has a high heat capacity. It can store far more energy than wood. Clay seals pores, slowing heat loss and preventing drafts. Dense mass radiates evenly, removing hot and cold zones. Slow convection circulates air without gusts that steal warmth. No heat is lost to the outside wall because the wall sits in the center of the cabin. One man frowned. So the wall holds the fire inside itself? Elias nodded. Yes. It keeps what your chimney throws away. It wasn't magic. It wasn't cheating. It was physics, though Elias never used that word. He simply said, I learned from cold places that never let heat escape. As the settlers left his cabin, their expressions were different now. Not mocking, not doubtful. but calculating quiet minds turning over the reality that everything they'd been taught about staying warm might have been flawed. A few men looked back at the uneven stone giant rising in Elias's home, the wall they had called stupid, ugly, foolish. Now they saw something else entirely, a machine of warmth, a battery of fire, a structure that bent the laws of winter itself. The valley had spent years trying to fight the cold. Elias had learned to outthink it. News travels strangely on the frontier. It doesn't move in straight lines or measured steps. It drifts carried by wind, by gossip, by the curiosity of men who don't want to admit they're curious. Within a week, nearly every settler in the valley had heard about the miracle wall inside Elias Norberg's cabin. Some laughed outright. Some scoffed. Some muttered that Elias must be burning a secret stockpile of hardwood or using European tricks. But others, especially those who had spent the last nights feeding their fire hourly just to keep their children from shivering, felt something deeper than skepticism. They felt hope. The first copycats. The first man to attempt a replica was Thomas Reed, a confident builder who believed that fortitude and pride could substitute for understanding. He hauled stones without sorting them, scooped clay from the creek bank without testing it, and stacked his wall as though speed were the goal. "It ain't complicated," he barked, "just rocks and mud." Elias tried gently to warn him about proportions, air channels, firebox geometry. Reed waved him off. "I've built 6 cabins. Don't tell me about stone." When Reed lit his first fire, the smoke curled straight back into his cabin, filling the single room with a choking, oily haze. His family coughed through the night. His wife threw open the windows, despite the cold. By the next morning, Reed was tearing the wall down in shame. The second attempt. A week later, a lean man named Friedrich Hoffman approached Elias with humility Reed lacked. Hoffman had been a stonemason in Bavaria before crossing the Atlantic. He carried a notebook and listened more than he spoke. "I want to understand," he said simply. So Elias taught him the width of each channel, the rise of each upward turn, the size of the firebox, the ideal moisture of clay mortar, the spacing between outer stone and inner chamber. Together, they built a smaller version of Elias's wall, still massive compared to a regular hearth, but proportioned with almost mathematical precision. When Hoffman lit his first fire, the smoke drew smoothly through the channels, like water sliding down polished slate. 3 hours later, the wall pulsed with stored heat, radiating slow, even warmth. Hoffman's cabin held its temperature through the night. His wife cried from relief. A valley begins to change. Once Hoffman proved the concept could be replicated, the valley's attitude shifted. Suspicion gave way to cautious respect. Even Reed, his pride battered, slipped by Elias's cabin at dusk to ask a few tentative questions. By late winter, 3 more settlers had built their own versions. Some were neat, some were crude, some succeeded beautifully. Others worked only halfway, producing warmth, but lacking the longevity of Elias's masterpiece. Not every attempt was perfect, but every attempt taught the valley something new. And the biggest lesson was this: cold could be defeated without burning a forest to stumps. Families who once burned through a full cord of wood in a month now stretched the same supply nearly twice as long. Men who had spent entire days cutting and hauling timber gained hours, back hours, to mend fences, tend livestock, read by lamplight, or simply rest. The valley's nights grew quieter. Fires no longer snapped in desperation. People slept more, coughed less, worried less. They had mocked the wall. They had doubted the man who built it. But now, piece by piece, failure by failure, success by success, the valley was becoming a place shaped not by tradition, but by understanding. And the credit, whether they admitted it aloud or not, all traced back to the quiet Scandinavian with the stupid wall. By the second winter, the valley no longer spoke of Elias Norberg with mockery. They spoke of him with a new tone, quiet, thoughtful, almost reverent. His wall had survived the cruelest stretches of cold the mountains could send, and now it was reshaping how an entire community, approach survival. What began as curiosity soon became imitation. What began as imitation soon became innovation, a new kind of frontier knowledge. Unlike rifles, traps, or plows, a masonry heat wall was not a tool a man could simply borrow. It had to be understood. And the settlers, gruff, hard-working, stubborn in their ways, found themselves learning principles of heat and mass they'd never considered before. Children who once feared winter now pressed their hands against the warm stones of their homes, fascinated by the idea that a wall could remember fire. Women began shifting sleeping spaces closer to the radiant heat zones, discovering that the warm stone dried clothes, cured aches, and kept bread dough rising through the night. Frontier life is slow to change, but once the seed of improvement takes root, it spreads with surprising force. The first variations appear. Friedrich Hoffmann, the Bavarian stonemason, who had successfully built the first replica, was also the first to propose an improvement. "You make heat," he told Elias one afternoon, "and heat should do work." He added a small clay brick oven into the side of his heat wall. It was nothing more than a pocket of space designed to trap higher temperatures. But the results were transformative. Bread baked evenly, roasts cooked through, and families saved fuel that would have otherwise been spent on separate cooking fires. Then came another settler, Mrs. Margaret Doyle, who noticed something else. Her wash basin placed near the wall warmed naturally by midday. With Elias's guidance, she and her husband embedded a small copper tank, salvaged from an old still, into the upper portion of their wall. Soon the Doyles had hot water each morning, something unheard of on the frontier. Next came a hunter named Applewhite, whose rheumatism kept him awake during the cold months. He built a sleeping bunk directly against the wall's south-facing side. For the first time in years, he slept through the night without pain. His adaptation spread quickly. Each new version honored Elias's design while adding its own ingenuity. Each improvement carried the same principle: make every ounce of heat count. The woodpile tells the truth. Frontier talk is cheap. Wood, on the other hand, is honest. By early spring, families who had once burned through towering woodpiles found they were using nearly half as much as before. The hillsides around the valley, stripped bare each winter by axes, began showing signs of recovery. Saplings rose in places long left empty. Even the wildlife returned sooner, sensing the presence of shelter and food. For the first time, people had time to focus on planting, mending tools, helping neighbors, even resting. Time that had once been surrendered to the endless labor of feeding a fire. Elias's role changes. The man who once worked alone now found settlers at his doorstep, daily asking questions, taking notes, sketching diagrams. Elias never charged. He never demanded recognition. He simply shared what he knew, correcting mistakes, gently explaining principles, plainly. He had not come west to teach. But the frontier has a way of choosing its teachers. Through his quiet generosity, the heat wall evolved from an eccentric idea into a regional tradition, a signature of the Wyoming homesteads that valued endurance over appearance. And all of it began with one man who refused to waste heat. As the years passed, the heat wall became as much a part of the valley as the cottonwoods by the creek or the long shadow of the western ridge at sundown. Cabins that once shivered in winter now glowed with a gentle, even warmth. Children who had woken to frost on their blankets grew up thinking it perfectly normal to pad barefoot across warm floorboards on the coldest mornings. The heat wall wasn't a marvel anymore. It was simply how things were done. Yet everyone knew where it began. With a man who asked no praise, took no credit, and never claimed invention, only understanding. The wall outlives the mockery. Elias aged slowly and quietly, like the stones in his wall. His beard whitened. His hands grew stiff. But every winter, neighbors still found him at the table beside that warm monolith, sipping broth or sharpening tools as steady as the radiant heat beside him. He lived to see the valley grow. He lived to see families prosper because they no longer spent half their waking hours chopping wood. He lived to see his stupid wall become a symbol of wisdom. But he also lived to see something more important the next generation carry the idea forward. His eldest daughter, Ruth, would tell her children, "Your grandfather built a wall that never forgot the fire." She meant it both literally and figuratively. For her, it wasn't just a heating system. It was proof that patience beats panic, that observation outruns tradition, that survival belongs to those who understand why things work, not just how they're supposed to. The researcher who came too late. Decades later, in the early years of the 20th century, a traveling researcher from a Western college arrived after hearing rumors of a strange type of heater used in remote cabins. But when he reached the valley, Elias's original cabin had already been abandoned, the logs sagging, the roof-collapsed grass creeping across the floor. Only the wall remained. Even in ruin, it held a quiet dignity. Even without fire, it warmed slightly under the afternoon sun, proof that mass remembers heat long after flames vanish. The researcher walked around it, tracing the uneven curves, measuring the stonework, surprised at how deliberate it all felt. He wrote in his notes, "This is frontier engineering at its finest, imperfect, intuitive, and decades ahead of the local knowledge around it." He never met Elias. He missed him by only a few years. But Ruth, now a grown woman with children of her own, repeated her father's lessons, and the researcher carried them back east, where they were studied, documented, and much later recognized as an American variant of an ancient European masonry heater. One man's quiet understanding had become a thread woven into the greater cloth of frontier history. Lessons that outlast the stones. By the time Elias passed, his wall had been replicated in dozens of cabins, then in hundreds of homes across Wyoming, Montana, and the Dakotas. Versions of it appeared in mining camps, trading posts, and even a few early ranger stations. But the true legacy wasn't the wall. It was the mindset behind it. Don't fight the cold, outthink it. Don't chase tradition, chase understanding. Don't burn more wood waste, less heat. Don't judge by appearance, judge by function. Those who had once mocked Elias eventually realized that survival favored humility, not bravado. The wall taught that wisdom often begins, quietly looks ugly at first, and is recognized only after it has warmed enough nights to earn respect. And so Elias's legacy lived on, not in monuments or stories told loudly around campfires, but in warm cabins, well-rested families, and the steady confidence that even the harshest winter could be met with knowledge instead of fear. Long after Elias Norberg's hands had grown too worn to lift stone, long after his beard had silvered and his gait slowed, the wall remained steadfast, immovable, a silent witness to everything the valley endured. Winters came and went, harsh and unforgiving. But the wall stood absorbing heat, releasing it, teaching generation after generation that survival was not a contest of strength, but a practice of understanding. Some men leave behind land. Some leave behind tools. Elias left behind a way of thinking. The changes no one predicted. By the third decade after Elias built his cabin, the valley looked different. Forests, once stripped bare during desperate winters, had regrown. Wildlife returned to the hillsides earlier each spring. Families who had once spent half their waking hours feeding fires now found themselves with time. Real time to improve their farms, mend their barns, teach their children, or simply breathe. The old rhythm of frontier survival cut, burn, freeze, repeat, had been broken, and a quieter, kinder rhythm took its place. Many settlers claimed the valley had grown warmer over the years. Not by weather, but by wisdom. A community once ruled by fear of winter now met it with a calm confidence. The generational echo. When Elias finally passed, his children gathered around the very wall that had warmed every winter of their lives. They placed their hands on it as if on the shoulder of an old friend. Ruth, his eldest, whispered. He gave us a fire that doesn't need tending. They meant it literally. They meant it metaphorically. For the Norberg family, that wall became a story retold through marriages, harvest seasons, and quiet evenings by lamplight. A lesson tucked into every reminder that ingenuity, not brute force, had secured their place in a land that punished the unprepared. And in time, as railroads came, towns grew, and technology marched forward, the wall's lessons didn't fade. They evolved. What the modern world almost forgot. By the early 20th century, the frontier gave way to homesteads with coal burners, then to homes with oil furnaces, and eventually to the convenient hum of electric heat. Many looked at masonry heaters as relics, curiosities from a more desperate era. But even as the world modernized, there were always a few who remembered. Researchers rediscovered frontier heat walls while searching for sustainable heating during the energy crises of the 1970s. They found buried references to the Norberg design, scribbled diagrams, oral histories, notes taken by homesteaders who had once tried to copy Elias's method. Engineers studying these old systems calculated that the walls captured as much as 70–80% of the fire's energy, far higher than most modern fireplaces. Suddenly, the stupid wall built by a quiet Scandinavian gained a new name in technical journals, the Norberg Radiant Mass Heater. But in the valley where it was born, people called it something simpler, Elias's way. What the wall really taught, standing today at the site of the old Norberg homestead. Now just a meadow dotted with stone fragments, you can still feel the faint outline of where the wall once stood. Grass grows through the gaps. Snow gathers around it. Time has softened its edges, but not its message. The lesson isn't about stone or clay or fire. It's about this. Innovation doesn't always look impressive. Wisdom doesn't always look elegant. Survival doesn't always look heroic. Sometimes it looks like a man working alone through 2 summers stacking ugly stones into an uglier shape because he understood something others didn't, that heat is precious, that waste is dangerous, and that a well-built life, like a well-built wall, should carry warmth long after the fire burns out. That is the legacy Elias Norberg left behind. Not a wall, a way forward.